Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host John Nash and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we are going to talk about royalties and sponsorships and all that jazz. But first, I want to find out, how are you, John? It's been a minute.
Yeah, no, I'm good. Good. Going through some, some family stuff. My dad's, I have a very elderly dad because I'm an old guy. So we're doing, he's in hospice right now. So that's why I've been missing shows. And I know I think we promised that we're going to look at Bellator and PFL contracts. And we're going to hold off a little bit. And the only reason we're going to hold off is because we don't have one that's filed in court that I can just pull down and share with anybody. I have to compile multiple contracts from people and then make sure that nothing we reveal is exclusively in one person's contract. We don't want to out the people that gave me the contract. So sorry, it takes a little time, and I've been preoccupied with other stuff. But we got this episode to feed people in need right now who are sitting around waiting for. I'm sure they're waiting with bated breath for the next Hey Not the Face podcast. So
I think this one's a really important one because there is a specific clause in the contracts that we didn't get to last time. And it's probably the most jarring one that I have seen out of the contracts that you've shown me. This particular clause, it's been on my mind for the last few weeks, and I have talked about it extensively because I'm quite proud of myself that I figured out why they made this clause.
Well, we think they made it. We don't know for sure, but why we think. But yeah, we will get to that at the end. But yeah, we should have talked about when we went over the new UFC contest. We should have talked about it, but I hadn't. I was trying to talk to people that are much more knowledgeable about specific contract law, about contract law, and about image and copyright law. So it was only after, that was after the episode I finally got to talk to a bunch of people about what it possibly could mean. So that's why, but we'll get to that.
Yes. Right now, what we want to do is open up the show. We had a really, really good listener question from Twitter user Nick Jolly. And he asked that during the 3 years that John Jones was away, would he have gotten stuff from the UFC, specifically anything as far as image rights, DVD sales, uniform sales, any other promotional money, not to mention champion bonuses, etc. This was asked in response to a tweet that I made because Dana said in an interview that John could afford to take those 3 years off because he was paid so well. And then in the same interview, not 2 minutes later, he said that he himself, Dana White, couldn't afford to take 3 years away. And it just blew my mind. But the point is that Nick Jolly responded to that with what John might have gotten during the 3 years he was away. So, John, obviously this would be an opinion-based question, but we would love to know what you think he might have gotten.
Well, first I got to, hats off to Nick Jolly. No degenerate. I know he follows me on Twitter and I interact with him a bunch. So, hats off for him for asking a question instead of just being drunk in a corner somewhere. No, I'm just kidding. Anyways, what I thought was amusing that Dana White said he couldn't last 3 years, and I'm like, you really do have a gambling problem, Dana, if that's true, because you are sitting on just a pile of money. So what does John Jones make? What does he make on his merchandise for the UFC? Not outside the UFC. He can have T-shirts and stuff he can make with other companies that don't bear UFC logos. He can do that, so he probably makes a little money on that. But I don't know exactly. It's hard for me to ballpark what he's making with the UFC on the merchandise. But I'm sure it's, for a normal person, for a regular fighter, it's probably a large amount. But I can't imagine it's a massive amount of money, because we'll get into the details of what percentage they make. But it might be, for someone of his caliber, status, it might be 100, in the six figures, low six figures for all that merchandise. One thing I do note is we'll probably talk a little bit about sponsorship too, is John Jones. I don't think he does a lot of sponsorship jobs with the UFC, so he wouldn't make money on that. So in other words, I don't really know, but I don't think considering the lifestyle he lives and stuff, I think most of it was his savings that he made from fighting, and what he's making from royalties from the UFC is probably low six figures.
So I came across a website, and we have often pointed and laughed about websites that try to bolster numbers and act like they know what purses are, like what each event has paid out in purses. And we can't possibly know that unless we're in specific states, because so many of them now are not bound to reveal the purse values. So I came across this site, though, that does something a little different. This is fightbookmma.com, and salute to you, because what they do is they only put out articles that show what the Venom pay is. That's it. They don't try to guesstimate what the purses might be with these totals tacked on or anything like that. They make no guesstimates, and I appreciate that. So all we get are the facts here. But I noticed they put one thing on here, and I have this as a question for you. In addition to the base pay, UFC fighters will receive perpetuity royalty payments amounting to 20 to 30% of any UFC merchandise sold that bears their likeness, according to officials. So, my question is, could you explain that? And also, what constitutes likeness? Because it says any UFC merchandise sold that bears their likeness. And the reason I ask that is I want to know, does that constitute just their image, like their physical image, a photo of them, or could it be their name as well, like on a pair of fight shorts?
Okay, well, first of all, we should also note that too, one of our favorite guys, Finley Beaton, at least one of my favorite guys, because he keeps track of my victories every week. He also follows along the outfitter policy payments, and he keeps track of those. So I think he even includes them. Workshop individual. It's a tab on there, I believe. So hats off to him as well for keeping track of that.
Sir.
And I at the end of the year I use his totals as well. Well, the image, what the UFC calls it is your identity, the fighter's identity, is their image rights. That includes their image, like you said, a photo or image of them, the actual video or capture of what they look like, a likeness, so like a caricature, a cartoon, or something that's supposed to be them. That would be included. Their voice, if they use their voice in a product, like if they record them in a video game or something, they have to pay them for that, and their name too. Yeah, so their name as well, as long as it's a name that is identified with them specifically. If they have multiple fighters with the same name, then it's a question of what fighter they're referring to. But if they use your name and it's supposed to be you that they're referring to, then yeah, if it's a product with your name, so like those old Reebok kits that had a Giblet, that fighter got a royalty from those sales.
But what if there's no Giblet?
Well, then I don't get. I'm still wondering if Gilbert got any of those, so we'll see. But Giblet made a fortune on that one.
Okay, so let's talk about royalties. What do fighters get paid for?
Well, we talked about the image rights there, the identity of the fighter. So they get paid for anything that has their image, likeness, like we said, on the product. Except there's important exceptions for that. So they get paid for all that, but what they don't get paid for is something called event merchandise. And so if you buy a T-shirt that has the fighter's rights, or a dollar, or a card, any of those items, collector's card, the fighter will get that. But there's things for the event merchandise that's identified as UFC as any merchandise or other product derived from, created, used, or sold in connection with any bouts, pre-bouts, or post-bouts events. In other words, the material that's made for the fight, like a poster that advertises it, the fight itself, the stuff that is maybe the interviews and stuff after the fight or before the lead up, the weigh-ins, anything that they use from that, fighters don't get paid for that. And so I think we talked about it before on the contract. So all those autographs they do, right? Mm-hmm. They auction off those autographs, they sell them. Fighters get none of the royalties from those autographs, because those are event merchandise. The shirts that are made that say UFC 286 at the event, or even sold later about that event, the fighter gets none of the royalties from that. All that stuff is excluded, and that's a big chunk of the merchandise, the amount of money the UFC is making.
Has there ever been a reason pondered why that might be? Why they specifically exclude them from just that?
Well, I mean, it kind of goes back in boxing. When you sell your rights to a fight, you're basically selling the promoter your rights to that fight. So they own the fight like like an old boxing match. Then they can sell that boxing match to ESPN as a or some other some other place in the future. The promoter gets to use the rights. The UFC has just taken that concept and expanded it to cover a lot more stuff. Because in boxing, like I think we saw in Cambosos' contract, he owned the rights to a lot of the merchandise that was sold at the arena, right?
Mm.
The UFC saying, no, we get those. That's our right to sell merchandise at the arena only, and we get to keep that money. So really, yeah, the UFC took the kind of a boxing model where you're handing over the rights to the fight and said we're going to expand it to everything that's covered under the fight that or goes along with that specific event fight. And on top of that, like the UFC, they also, because they own the fight footage, they can sell that fight footage for commercials. So, if you want to be in a commercial, remember that Super Bowl ad with Dustin Poirier,
Mhm.
and they show him fighting Conor McGregor, and they never mention Conor McGregor's name, and they also shows Rose Namajunas. Well, I don't know if Rose got paid, but she was already repping that company. I can't remember who was the company he was doing it for, but Dustin was hired to be a sponsor in the ad, so he got paid. But McGregor, he got nothing for that. They took his footage, they put in that commercial, and he got no money because that was already under the agreement. The UFC owned that.
So how much do fighters actually get?
Well, okay, so that thing you shared with me, they said 20 and 30%. That seems to be based on an older agreement. The current common, what we see in multiple contracts, the current agreement is merchandise royalties are equal to either 15% of gross revenue or 30% of net revenue. And then the UFC divide, gross revenue is basically when the UFC gets it's basically when they sell, when someone else is selling the product and the UFC gets a cut without having to do anything for it. And then the fighter will get 30% of that. But if the UFC has some part in selling it and then they have to deduct their own costs, their own expenses, all that stuff, then the fighter will only get 15%. And that's considered net revenue because it's after all the other expenses are done. So it's 30% or 15%, and it is in perpetuity. But again, it's only for those items that the fighter has the right to get sponsorship or to get royalty merchandise from.
So let's talk about sponsorship. How did we get here? Because I tell you what, we went from the golden age of sponsors to having sponsors have to cough up six figures to be a sponsor. They had to cough up $100,000 was the entry when they finally told the fighters, "Hey, if you want to have a sponsor on your person, on your shorts, whatever, your sponsor has to pay us 100,000 bare minimum, and that's how you can have your sponsor. Otherwise, you get to have just your banner hanging over the fence." And then they even did away with that. And now here we are, and fighters must wear a uniform even though they're supposedly independent contractors. How did we get here?
Well, you went through a lot of it right there. We started the UFC to compete. They let fighters have their own sponsors, and then was it Swick that invented the banner
Yes.
with AKA? So
Yes.
they invented the banner, and then so the fighters had another means to add this revenue, and that's how the UFC could kind of like compete, especially with Pride in the early days because Pride was paying more back then. So fighters, they had their own sponsorship. The UFC didn't have to pay as much, but the fighters could make a lot of the sponsorship, especially when they got in Spike and sponsors were getting free airtime to sponsor fighters. But then the UFC, because I mean they had a plan for a long time to build up sponsorship revenue, they started adding the sponsorship tag. I think the first one was 50,000, then it went up to 100,000, like you said. And it started with specific sponsors that the UFC had their own sponsor or were trying to convince those people sponsoring fighters that no, you should sponsor the UFC instead because it'll be cheaper. The UFC had a sponsor that they wanted or wanted a category of sponsors to become a UFC official sponsor, and so they would tax that. And so that dried up some of the money from the fighters, and it went to the UFC. And then eventually they came up through the uniform deal, which basically got rid of all sponsors. And now the uniform deal, what that did also is it made sure that if you wanted to be in the octagon, if you wanted to, you couldn't go to a fighter and pay the fighters to wear your logo or brand. You had to go to the UFC. And so the UFC's sponsorship revenues just skyrocketed since then. So that's kind of how we got here. It was, the fighters protested a lot, but it was such a slow, it's like the frog in the water, boiling water, turning up. They did it step by step to a point that the fighters just conceded. But there was a little bit of pushback. I remember fighters were angry every step of the way. Every time something new was introduced, fighters were angry. But then after a few years, you have a brand new crop of fighters that don't remember what it was like before, and they accept it.
Now, I have another question on this. We've reviewed it once before in the past, but for the purpose of new listeners, we should review it again. In the beginning, when we did away with all the sponsors, there were groups that spoke out, mainly the higher paid ones, but then the lower paid ones weren't really saying much. Is it true what they were saying, that the lower paid guys were pretty happy with it because so many sponsors were stiffing them or they weren't able?
Well, I think that's partly true because there's a couple things. One, back then there were still the dark prelim matches, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have dark prelim matches. So you are not getting the big sponsors because you are not walking out in front of a large TV audience. So for those fighters who are stuck in the prelims that were, maybe at that time, I think they're on Facebook, or not getting this huge audience, you were not going to make a lot on the sponsors. There's also the thing that the UFC was adding a sponsor tax for years now and had been increasing it. So it was drying up the sponsorship for a lot of the fighters because it was too expensive for a lot of sponsors to get in the cage. And so only the top guys, or not top, but the most visible guys, were getting the best sponsors that could pay them enough. And those guys were still making, a lot of them were making six figures a fight. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but there's $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 a fight was not uncommon for a consistent main card type fighter, or a consistent fighter that was, well enough known. And so, but because, like I said, they did these steps by step to kind of dry it up, I think, to make sure that fighters, that when they finally did introduce the sponsorship, the Reebok deal, that the majority of fighters would kind of accept it without going ballistic. Although I know tales, I've talked to fighters that before it was introduced, Reebok would come in and tell everybody how it worked. And the Reebok presentation would never get completed because the fighters would just be yelling at them about what happened to my, who's going to replace this money. and the reason the Reebok was kind of caught off guard is supposedly, like pretty good source, supposedly the UFC sent Matt Hughes, Chuck Liddell, and Ronda Rousey to Reebok to give a presentation where they were told that the fighters were going to accept them as liberators. Basically, it's like being, when the Iraq War was happening, we're going to be greeted as liberators in the street. The fighters are just going to rejoice when this happens. And Reebok was caught off guard because they were not ready for how many fighters were upset about it. But again, a few years later, the only a select few of fighters were really upset because they dried up the sponsorship, and the turnover in the sport is, after a few years, the uproar over it disappeared.
Just hearing Reebok referred to as the liberators, my goodness. So let's talk about the outfitter policy and the kits themselves. How does that work?
Well, this is the Venom payments. So that's an outfitter. That's part of the outfitter policy. It used to be like, we used to call it the Reebok deal, where you showed up in the fight and you had to wear this and you get paid. But the UFC's kind of expanded it, and it really covers fight week, the whole week. You have to do certain things, not just wear the Venom kit now. You have to show up for the press conferences, do the appearances, sign the autographs like they say. You got to do all these things. And if you do, you get the amount of money that the UFC's declared that fighters get for the kit. I can't remember the specifics right now, but I think it's like 6,000, 10,000, it goes up in tiers, but you get paid that amount for showing up, doing all the stuff in fight week. Now, they're also in the outfitter policy, although the Venom kit payments don't usually include this, is you're required to do some promotional for the fight. So you might have to fly to another event and appear on TV, 2 months before your fight after it's been announced. You're required to do this, or you might be required to go somewhere else and promote the UFC on TV for an ESPN deal or something. Often the UFC will now compensate fighters for some of these appearances, but in the past, and some of the compensation might come with the outfitter kit. But if you remember in the past, like Roger Horta had a big complaint, they were flying them all over to make appearances on behalf of their sponsors and not getting paid. And so they've kind of stopped that practice. They pay fighters now to make appearances with sponsors, but in the past they used to take advantage of it. But now it's kind of outlined in that outfitter policy.
Sponsorships and appearance fees between fighters and sponsors arranged by the UFC. How does that work? And how much does that pay?
Okay, I touched on that just briefly with Roger Huerta because, like I said, he was flying around and other fighters were flying around these sponsors, and a lot of that's covered by the outfitter policy. But in the past, they used to really take advantage of this. But now, what the UFC does is, if you're one of the sponsors of the UFC, and you paid for the UFC, let's say $5 million a year, right?
Uh-huh.
A percentage of that is often set aside to go to the fighters for the fighters to serve as ambassadors or sponsors themselves for the product. So the UFC is basically saying, when you pay us, not only do you get the UFC, not only do you get your logo on the cage, you get access to our fighters to represent your product. I mean, not just in the cage, but to be like basically ambassadors or sponsors themselves. And so the UFC selling their fighters as part of the package. And so the UFC, because of the Reebok deal, now the Venom deal, the outfit policy, a lot of the sponsorship has dried up, and fighters, it's hard for fighters to get access to sponsors because if they have a sponsor, the rival that's might be in the octagon, so it kind of negates it. The UFC arranges and says, we have this money. How would you like some money from our sponsor to represent him? Like, Justin Gaethje, when he did that, I think it was him and Chandler did that beer ad, right? They're on TV together. That was arranged by the UFC. They hooked up those fighters to be representatives of this sponsor and get paid for them. So it's weird. They're acting almost as managers, right? That's a manager's job, but the UFC, as a promoter, is kind of acting as a manager, and so that's conflict of interest potentially. But so the UFC can set up. That's why a lot of mid-tier fighters are super happy with the UFC because they can't get sponsorship. You remember Jake Matthews was complaining about people complaining about UFC pay. Well, he talked about how he does appearances and gets all these deals. The UFC sets up and makes all this extra money. That's this. The UFC's collecting money from the sponsors, then giving it to the fighters to represent it, but it's a small percentage of what they get.
So I'm going to go out on a limb and say they definitely take advantage of this.
Oh, you imagine, huh? You think so? Well, as you said, if the UFC is the one in charge of this, you can see how easily it is to take advantage, because if you're on the outs of the UFC, you're not going to get these sponsorship deals. And so that extra income that you might depend on or want is only for those fighters that are in the good grace of the UFC, that are company men. And that's why you see the better company men, using air quotations here, appearing in those ads representing UFC sponsors. Because UFC, my understanding, and I'm not going to Zuffa offices, but my understanding is when a company asks to use a specific fighter, they run it by the matchmakers or Hunter Campbell or Dana White and see if they can use that fighter. Because fighters that are on the outs, that are not re-signing the deal, not taking the fights they want, they might say that fighter's not a company man. He does not get a sponsorship deal.
Let's talk about video game rights. What, if anything, do fighters get from the video game? And how long does the UFC get those rights?
Well, in the past, when this first became an uproar, when John Fitch was cut from the UFC for refusing to sign, the fighters got nothing from the video game rights. That was the big outrage. They got paid nothing, and the UFC owned those rights in perpetuity. Since then, they've changed it. The UFC, they have 3 years after you sign the contract to use your rights. If they don't, then they're not going to put it in a video game. But if they do put it in a video game, they own the rights to use them in a video game for the duration of your contract plus 2 additional years. After that, they can no longer put it in they can't make new video games with you in it. But they have a large range of stuff. As under the terms of the video game, any video game which features fighting, including without limitation, MMA, wrestling, professional, entertainment wrestling, and individual discipline martial arts, they can use it. So let's say instead of a UFC game that's about the UFC, what if there's like a Mortal Kombat type game or a version of a game that has fighters engaging in professional wrestling? They could use your image for games like that. But it doesn't last in perpetuity. And the UFC pays fighters now. But here's the kicker. It's discretionary pay. It's up to the UFC how much they're going to pay you. They guarantee you if they use you in a video game, you'll get at least one payment. But for each additional appearance in a new updated version of that game, there's no guarantee you'll get paid. And again, it's discretionary. It's up to the UFC how much they're going to pay you to be in the video game.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I mean, the restrictive nature of these contracts, it's mind-boggling, John. I can't imagine how any manager in good faith could tell his client, go ahead, sign this.
Because the alternative to the exchange is not better for the fighter. That's the problem. We'll have to talk about managers and choices in a future episode, but a lot of it is that the managers are very limited in their options. But yeah, you look at these contracts and you show them to other people outside the business, and they're amazed what the contracts are. And like, I would never sign this, but when you don't have an option, that's why they're called adhesive contracts. Because you have to take them. There's no other option. And so you're stuck with stuff like this.
All right. So let's get down to brass tacks. And brass tacks is a specific clause that we did not go over, but we're going to talk about right now. So hopefully I can get through this without mangling it too much. Here goes. Zuffa shall own in perpetuity UFC content and all of the rights, products, and proceeds in and to, or derived from, the use or other disposition of UFC content, and shall have the right to do all things necessary for the full and complete exploitation and exercise of UFC content, including, without limitation, to secure in the name of Zuffa or that of its nominee, copyright, and other protection to the fullest extent available in the United States and all other countries of the world where such protection is available. Fighter irrevocably agrees that all copyrightable material, notes, records, drawings, designs, inventions, improvements, developments, discoveries, and trade secrets conceived, made, or discovered by the fighter solely or in collaboration with others during the term that fighter became associated with in the course of fighter's performance under this agreement, and use the UFC brand, marks or trademarks collectively, quote, work product, are the sole property of Zuffa in perpetuity. Fighter further shall irrevocably assign or cause to be assigned, and does hereby assign fully to Zuffa all work product and any copyrights, patents, mask work rights, or other intellectual property rights relating thereto in perpetuity. So, bearing all that in mind, listening to all of that, hearing myself say all of that, I must ask you, what is this new clause? What does it mean for the fighters? And is it as bad as it sounds to me?
Well, okay, there's two parts to that clause. The first part you read is it's the same language we saw in previous ones, that they basically own everything, right? But the new part is that second, basically the work product stuff, that the fighter agrees that all copyrighted materials, notes, records, drawing, designs, basically anything they come up with, trade secrets, anything that is discovered by fighter in collaboration, by solely in collaboration with others, during the term that the fighter became associated with, and in the course of the fighter's performance under this agreement, and uses the UFC brand, marks, or trademarks, are the sole property of Zuffa in perpetuity. And it's hard to say exactly what that means, because I asked around. I asked various attorneys. I asked boxing attorneys and contract attorneys, and I went and saw a very high-level image and copyright law attorney. And when they read it, they're kind of amazed because that is really strong language you would see in an independent contractor contract, right?
Mhm.
That's the type of stuff you see in engineers or executives because you can't lose trade secrets. See that people that are working on special drugs and stuff for pharmacies where they don't want them to leave with that knowledge and use it somewhere else right away, right? That's where you see there. You don't usually see with fighters. And so what that says right there is that the fighter comes up with something, why they're a UFC fighter, and it's the language is a little vague, but it could be read one way is that if it uses the UFC brand, in other words, you come up with a product, but it uses something that the UFC like the octagon or the UFC logo or something like that. But it's read vague enough that it possibly could be expanded further than that, only that it uses the fighter when he's associated with the UFC. That's the part that's a little scary. But the UFC gets the rights to that. So if another Conor McGregor, if someone comes up with something like a proper 12 on their own, or a chili, or some other food stuff, or some other product, does the UFC get a cut of that? Does the UFC own that? That's the question. I mean, you could probably contest it, but the language is vague enough that maybe the UFC would win in a case because now you got to go to arbitration. You don't go to attorneys, right? Because the new arbitration clause. So the thinking someone told me is that one of the ideas might be it's vague enough and scary enough that the fighter, instead of risking it, might cut the UFC on the deal if they came up with something.
What I figured was that this was made in response to the insane success that Conor McGregor had with Proper Number 12. When he and his partners sold their 49% share, it went for like 700 million. And I remember you told me that Connor's share was probably between 150 and 175. That's almost 200 million. That is nothing to sneeze at. And I think the UFC looked at that and said, we want that. That's our money. That's my
Oh,
money. You know?
I think you're on. I mean, again, there's no way of knowing. I'm not sitting in the room with the
Right.
heads of the UFC, but that seems like a fair interpretation. My understanding is that the UFC was frustrated that Conor cut that deal. What Conor did is I don't think his purses are as high as he claims, but what he did very smart is when he renegotiated for UFC 229. My understanding is his purses were only slightly more than what he would have gotten in his previous agreement, but he demanded part of the agreement was he gets space in the octagon. He gets some marketing space. And that's where he brought in Proper 12, and that blew up. The UFC, again, I'm going off kind of hearsay here, but I've been told the UFC, some of the UFC brass views that as, oh, we made that for you. You didn't make the Proper 12 a success. It's only a success because you put it in the octagon. So that really should have been our success. And so it makes sense that they're now doing this in the contract saying we get a piece of all this because in the future, we do not want to see any other fighter do this and we not get a piece of the action. And in fact, there's some people told me that's what they think Dana White's been trying to do with Hollerhead, basically prove that, we can do it on our own.
But Howlerhead hasn't had the success that Proper 12 had.
That seems to suggest that maybe Conor McGregor was a big part. And it wasn't just because it was in the
And
octagon, right?
that is what I wanted to get to, is because Connor actually unveiled that way, way before anybody thought, because he didn't actually launch it officially, I believe, until 2018, but he unveiled it the night of the Floyd Mayweather fight in the post-fight presser. And I went back and I viewed it as well. He has the bottle with him. You can clearly see the Proper on it. And he says, coming soon, Notorious Whiskey. And he has it in his hand and he's got the glass and you can see that it says Proper on it. You can't see the 12, but you can see the Proper very clearly. And he had it all the way back then, and then they unveiled it in 2018 officially. But I feel like he did that off of the back of all of his fights and his big ass mouth. I don't think the UFC had much to do with it, to be quite honest. But
no, I agree with you. But what's interesting about this is because I would like to look forward to future contracts. I'm going to give a hands up because of the new arbitration clause. One thing to look for is are these this section going to get even worse for fighters, right? Is it going to get even more in the UFC's favor because they have a thing where you can't be part of a class action and you have to go to arbitration. They're kind of protected. I could see them making this language even stronger for them. And I wonder, people like Sean O'Malley that have these big plans to be the next Conor McGregor. Was this in your contract? I would really like to know for Sean O'Malley, was this in his contract? Because he represented himself. I'm not sure that him representing himself, was he able, did he point this out and say, I need this removed? And did they remove it or not? Those are things I'm very curious about. I'd like to know going forward.
Oh, me too. And that is what spurred on this whole conversation. Is I remember going to you and asking you, what did you mean? And when you showed me this clause, I was just floored. So my next question to you before we wrap this up, you said they could make this even more restrictive. How? Tell me an example.
Well, I think one way they could do is they could take out some of the vague language about using the UFC brands or marks or trademarks, right?
Okay.
If they got rid of that, then basically, yes, anything you came up with while under UFC contract, they would own the rights to. So that would be, I don't know how that would hold up in a court, but again, you don't go to court anymore. You go to arbitration for anything in the contract. So, and language like that might be so intimidating that if a fighter did have either they're just not going to make the products, or if they did, they would have to go to the UFC and say, what kind of deal can we strike that I can have this product? See, another guy would be interesting to talk to is Dustin Poirier about that, because he has his hot sauce, right?
Uh-huh.
I don't know what is the deal if he did something like Conor before they introduced this provision, and so he owns it himself, or was something like this included in his new contract? Things like that. Did he have to cut the UFC on the deal with his product? I don't know. Those are things I'd be interested in seeing. But this opens up a whole new avenue for the UFC where they can get, before fighters, it's interesting because before fighters had managers that would look on ways to increase their purses. And then the UFC became the biggest player, the only player, and kind of controlled, who got in the UFC and not. So managers stopped kind of like really fighting over pay on that front. So they became specialists and sponsors. Then the UFC took away the sponsors, right? And so now you see a string of managers that are very good at select fighters using their image to get these kind of auxiliary rights outside the UFC. And now the UFC seems to be taking that away.
Wow, I don't even know how this is legal, but I imagine we're going to find somebody that's going to challenge it at some point, right?
Maybe. I mean, one thing you don't see a lot of people challenging the UFC.
Yeah.
It's just a handful. It's an uncommon thing for people to do because the UFC has a huge amount of resources and a lot of stuff in their favor. And so I guess maybe, I mean, there's a lot of stuff people have told me they don't think would hold up in a court, but first you need standing and then you need the resources to challenge them. And you no longer can you do a class action. So that probably dwindles the number of fighters that could possibly challenge them just to a handful.
Could I ask one last question, specifically about the arbitration clause? Yep. Does that clause only bar you from doing class action lawsuits, or does it bar any lawsuit?
Well, what it bars is you can't do a class action, so you have to represent yourself, and you can't go into a court. You can't go into a state or federal court. You have to go to arbitration with any disagreement in the contract.
So it
bars you technically from any lawsuit, except for stuff that's technically illegal that has nothing to do with the contract.
Okay.
But bars you, so anything in the contract, disagreements about anything in the contract, you have to go to arbitration. You can't go into a regular court.
So what do you have for us in the future?
Well, we're going to try to get, I know we're going to try to get the other PFL and Bellator contract episode done. I guess probably we'll talk about managers coming up. That seems to be something worthwhile talking about.
Yes.
Hoping some surprises coming up, but unfortunately, also, like I said, I have some family issues I got to take care of with my father. So we're going to really try to get the contract episode done, but I might be out of the loop for a few weeks.
So, on that fine note, do me a favor, follow this guy on Twitter, because that is his only social media. He is at Hey Not The Face. You can follow me at Crooklyn MMA.
It's not in the face! Thank you.